So what Crenshaw was describing when she was describing intersectionality was the points in these systems where the women at the centre are invisible because they only exist as legal fictions for each different institution joined around them, and how that compounds and recreates abuse. And we see with TERF how reducing womanhood to an identity facet that actually doesn't even belong to women and removing it from physical is the first step to recreating abusive power relations. Well, that's also true in personal relationships, and it's also true in institutional relationships. When an institution reduces someone down to a legal fiction or an object and they can't see the rest of that person, it creates abuse. So welfare economics can't see family law can't see welfare economics. They're both meeting around these women who can't meet both demands made on them, and that's the crisis that's coming out because of austerity. But at the centre of it is these women who are invisible, and that's working class women who are the subjects of policy. Me, mothers, ex-looked after children, and we're completely invisible. And the laws and rights that we're discussing here evolved not through traditional political action, but through deaths and harm and state failure and agreements between citizen and state that are held under the crown that are nothing to do with policymakers. And what you're seeing with the word TERF is what I identified in my dissertation, which is a reflex response to lash out at what they can't see, which is us, which is what played out with austerity. So simultaneously they removed they're still battering people with cash transfer system, they removed legal aid in the family courts, women were left unable to deal with domestic abuse and then had their children taken permanently because all these institutions weren't looking at how they connected, which now they'll be forced to through crisis, around this central point, which is these invisible women, us, which is why I do these videos. I make sure that this perspective is visible, and just making sure that my perspective is visible to a political media culture who have a blind spot around these systems, these laws, and women like me has led to my life being fucking destroyed for 8 years by these people. What I identified in my dissertation was that this was a reflex response. Now, a reflex response to crisis is one that's never been challenged and is usually born of identity. Now, the important thing with a reflex is that it's never been challenged, and this comes back to this thing about there never having been sufficient crisis to synthesise what these institutions do. And certainly in the late 70s, which was the last time we had a crisis where that opportunity may have presented itself, these changes were not in evidence. So this is the first crisis. So even though it feels like, and it has been contributed to by misogyny, and it has been contributed to by elite social closure, and we have seen from the left and the media culture on Twitter how they will abuse women to maintain that consensus, that's largely broken down because we can see it, describe it, and it will be demonstrated. Right now with the left, you only have to say they will use language to try and prevent discussion of political consensus on system failure that's happening. That's them without identity, dead. Because these crises are what are at the centre of this, and what's at the centre of this is what has to be exposed is the invisibility of those women, us. And the way that that invisibility repeats through institutions, and institutions join together around us to create an impossible situation. But this mixes up with normal human power relations. You know, these institutions evolved naturally from a point where women were owned. You know, women are still fighting against systems that are designed to keep them owned. Our welfare economics still suggests that women should be owned within marriage, which implicitly suggests that women and children should be abused. This is no longer the law. But in order to get that recognition of the rule of law at a policy-making level, it appears that we have generated the crisis around TERF, which is the same institutions who have always reproduced the system of the symbolism of the lone parent, have just transferred it to TERF, and are demonstrating what it is. The word TERF illustrates which institutions are not aware of this rule of law, and the role that we play as women right now is we're correcting that, and we're doing it quite easily. Because they've moved into a landscape where they've got to mix with us. And all the shifts that I'm talking about, they have to address because they can't get out of any number of policy crises before they do. But before they can address those shifts, they have to address what they can't see, which is women. Which is why, like, women don't have to understand all the stuff that I understand. They don't have to understand these fault lines. I'm just telling you that you're sat on these fault lines. You don't need to understand them. The thing that's missing from our political economy that's at the root of crisis is that politicians can't see you. And by making sure they can see you, by screaming out loud about the tough business of all this, you're correcting that. And in doing so, you're correcting a blind spot that's existed and harmed women for 30 odd years at the first possible opportunity. That's really, really important. That's you clarifying that neoliberalism's over and we just have to move on, and all parties. Because this is laws that have already been passed, because this is crisis that we need to have, all that really will happen is that, bar the initial noise, which is the tantrums from the left and from media feminists, and the tantrums from those who thought they could hide from this rule of law, they don't have a choice. You're not doing this to them. They already needed to be aware of this rule of law. You're just saying, I'm here too. And you need me. And the reason that your trade unions are so scared of you is because all you've got to say is, you're not representing us, and they